So I'd like to welcome Thomas Proell, Art Manion, and Thomas Schmidt and their presentation. Best of luck, and handing over to you.
Great. We're on, good. Can folks in the room hear me okay? Yep. May I ask my colleagues to stand for a moment?
Sure.
So, hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Art. This is my colleague, Thomas. This is my other colleague, Thomas. We have a naming problem. I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. To carry on from here.
Sure. As Art has said, we have a naming problem. And to make it easier for you in the discussion afterwards, we're actually going to be Thomas and Tom. So that makes it a little bit easier for you. There are only two things, said Phil Carton, that are hard in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. And as I'm not a hardware person, I don't have any idea about cache invalidation, but I have some thoughts about naming things. We know that global identification systems exist around the world, and some of them have solved some problems, like car identification. So there is a vehicle identification number. Or if we want to buy a book, say the famous book by our friend Alan Friedman, Cybersecurity and Cyberwar, we look at the backside and we see an ISBN. Or if we want to know where we find BSI's website, we look it up on the domain name system. So we have done some systems that are globally working, but at that point, we don't have the same thing for software. And the first question is, why is it hard? Well, actually, it is not hard in the NP thing of hard as we talk about that in computer science, but there are some challenges here. And one of the challenges is actually the name itself. So if we imagine a person that is called Elizabeth, their family might call her Lizzie, and their school-time friends might call her Liz, and her work friends call her Betty, and their nieces call her Aunt Bess, and her mom calls her sweetheart, and the dad calls her darling. If you have a cashier in Australia, they call her love. And if you have a spouse, might call her honey. And the grandpa that is a little bit weird already since he is so old, he calls her Anna since he thinks it's his daughter. So a name isn't really identity. It just gives a name to something, but it is not really bound to the identity. And if we talk about names, there are two things that we know. There are intrinsic naming schemes and extrinsic naming schemes. So if we talk about sodium chloride, we have an intrinsic naming scheme. It tells us exactly what sodium chloride consists of, sodium and chloride. And that gives us the structure. If you see the 7647-14-5, it's probably not that you instantly know what it is. It comes from the Chemistry Abstract Service, which is a service in the US, and it actually gives you a unique name, a unique ID to every chemical substance that is found in scientific literature. And it's the same thing, but now we have two names for it. And you'll know other famous extrinsic naming schemes like your social security number or your tax number. So those are extrinsic, there exists a register, and that links back to an identity. And there are different use cases here. So we need names for license management, for vulnerability management, to order hardware, and to download software. So we need some names to know what we are talking about. And we love that there is no market control over software, so actually anybody can write software and publish it. But on the flip side of that is there is also not a central register for software. So that basically provides us some challenges here. And names change all the time. So if Siemens chooses to buy a new company, they might change the name of the company or change the name of the product, or they carve out companies. So names are not really stable. There are a few current options here. We all know CPE, we know Schmidt and Proell, but just for the sake of that you can all follow along, we will show the options and some issues they have. There is CPE. It's currently maintained by NIST. It has some issues there. It's difficult to search. It works for some vendors very well, but it's really vendor and product specific whether it works or doesn't work. If you have kind of firmware in it, it is hard how to create a CPE for a firmware that is attached to one or different products. And it was specifically designed for vulnerabilities. So the thing is, if there hasn't been a vulnerability reported for that piece of software or that piece of hardware before, you might not find a number of CPE in there. And people came up with the weirdest names in there. So if you look especially on those slides here, you'll find all the different things that people made up names for, especially for Siemens. And I'm picking on you since you're sitting beside me. Then there is CERT. CERT is an ISO standard. There's a counterpart for hardware as well. And the issue is basically lots of people say, yeah, we support CERT, but actually nobody adopted it. So if you look on the websites, NIST says, yeah, we support CERT, but basically if you look on the NVD or something else, you couldn't find very much CERT adoption there. It's very version specific what you have, and it's XML. And who today likes writing XML? So, also the question is, are there tools available that we can actually use out of the box to generate software identities with CERT, or even hardware identities? And then there is a community-maintained approach, the package URLs. It works very good for ecosystems that have a naming authority, like package managers. But it also knows only very specific defined types. You can come up with your own types, but there you have the naming problem as well, since when you come up with the type, which is mandatory, you now have to know that it's not a conflict with somebody else coming up with a type that is named exactly the same, since migrate software is potentially also an author opinion that somebody else can have. Depending on where we got the software from, you might have different Proels for the same product. So it's not really a bidirectional unique identifier. And it's kind of hard to incorporate hardware in Proels. So if we think about criteria for a unique naming scheme, and I've listed here some of them that we should have in mind. So the first design criteria is, should a human be able to read that? The second one is, how do we deal with distributed production? If I create something and he creates something, is that the same thing? How do we avoid collisions there? Is it reproducible? If I create a name today, would it be then the same name tomorrow? How do we propagate that? So if I name something, how do you know that I provided or assigned that specific name to the thing? How precise is it? and how well defined is a product. If we have a complex scenario, can I only identify the hardware, or can I identify that piece of software that is running on this specific hardware? Is it really unique, or how much uniqueness do we need for a unique software identifier or hardware identifier? How do we prevent collisions here? How do we transit from today's system, which is basically we have different approaches to unique product identifiers, to a future world where we have the one unique product identifier? And how inclusive is it? Can we actually bring open source on board, or can we bring commercial vendors on board? Can we bring the large, the small ones, the proprietary, the free ones? Can everyone participate? And in terms, when my colleagues present their solutions, you should think about those standard scenarios and how they apply here. What if I want to rename a product or an organization? How do we deal in such situations with mergers and acquisitions, or respectively sell-offs? What if I have a white label product? So I purchase something that is exactly the same thing that another company sells, but I just put my logo on it. And how do I correct false information? Since we know humans are error prone, so all the things that we do might not be bug free. So there might also be in unique product identifiers some false information. So let's hit it off with the first solution, and I'll turn over to Art.
Thank you, Thomas. So we've solved this global identification problem, and my piece of the solution is, despite my previously conflicting thoughts on the topic, a global registrar or registry for all suppliers of software on the planet. That is the solution I'm going to propose in summary. So to add on a bit, hopefully to support and maybe add a bit to Thomas's criteria. You're Thomas, right?
Yes.
Thomas, okay. We're going to have this globally unique identifier system. Our code name for this talk is UPID. All suppliers must be able to participate, inclusivity, right? Responsibility and authority are tightly coupled with each other, otherwise you've made a broken system from the beginning. You have control. A software supplier today, there's really no sense or no way they're going to rename all of their stuff. That would be a fool's errand. So you get to keep all of your current naming, versioning, ID systems. If you have a completely complicated product line, great. Now you have to name it. If it's a simple product line, great, you still have to name it. You only need to interact and interface with those other parties that you immediately need to talk to anyway. And this is going to be sort of vertical in a supply chain. If I get software from someone, I have to talk to them. If I give software to someone else, I have to talk to them. You don't have to guess what further hops in a supply chain are doing. You just speak to your local adjacent nodes. That you are following the rules or not following the rules is fairly transparent. So without having to call and complain, others can observe dark spots in the graph and who is not playing by the rules. Number one is globally partition the entire namespace by supplier. I'm using supplier very, very broadly here. I've said vendor for many, many years. That wasn't exactly the right term. So, if you are developing, maintaining, selling, producing, manufacturing software systems, if you're providing software as a service, you're in here. Making software, responsible for software, you count as supplier for this talk. In addition, we're going to add a little bit to that. If you host a lot of software, or if you work in an ecosystem that already has sort of dependency and identity built into it, NPM is a great example, you also qualify as a first-level supplier, and we'll get to that in a moment. We debated this a bit, and I may have changed my mind, Thomas and Tom. I apologize if this is a surprise, but I'm I'm going to declare that we do not include the reseller. I tried to go to Best Buy this morning to buy one of these because that's where my brain was. They weren't open, but if I had purchased, I don't know, some Siemens device off the shelf at Best Buy, I don't care what Best Buy's supplier ID is or anything. I want the Siemens coordinates and the Siemens information. I'm now not convinced that supplier is still the right term because you could argue that Best Buy supplied me the Siemens device, but we're going to use supplier for today. Rule number 2, the supplier says, this is like Simon says, the supplier decides what the names are, the versions, the hierarchy if they have one, the product families, the product trees, the lines. That is entirely up to the supplier, which is how it is anyway, and this is hopefully trying to follow the natural order of these things. Yes, there are some very large suppliers of software on the internet. There are some very large software identification ecosystems on the internet. Yes, they carry, these dozens or 20s or 100 nodes carry a lot of extra influence and weight. That we're not going to try to change that. That's just naturally how things are at the moment. So these rules 3 and 4 are about your adjacency. If you use someone else's software, you must use their identifiers. You do not get to make up an identifier for them, even though this counteracts some, what did we work on? In the NTIA SBOM era, there was a paper about identification. It didn't solve identification, but it discussed some things. And the idea was use someone else's identifiers. If there aren't any, make something up. So taking back the make something up bullet, do not make something up. You just point to the supplier and leave it blank. This is part of the rule following transparency. 4th rule is if you provide software to someone, you must provide your identifiers. This is effectively you must give them SBOM. This could mean publishing. I don't want to scare anyone or get into a deep conversation about can my SBOM be public or not, or given only to my customers. The real answer is if you're providing software to someone, give them the SBOM, give them the names, the identifiers. I don't really care if it's public or not. Once you have more than a certain number of customers, it sort of becomes a public issue. Suppliers change, right? There are mergers, acquisitions, projects get forked and get archived and become stale. We need identification, supplier ID needs to have relationships too. So these are a couple of real examples found on the internet, public references. Avanti acquired Pulse Secure, famous, perhaps infamous VPN software. Logitech renamed themselves to Logi or Logi, I'm not sure exactly. Those are real things. Those are simple relationships you build in here and you're done, and the graph magic takes care of the rest. People will not follow the rules. Maybe your supplier did not give you identifiers. Well, complain and point to the supplier, and don't point to their product because you can't, because there are no identifiers. And right, many of their downstream users and customers pointing to them and not their product should highlight a hole in the graph, the lack of identifiers, which is rule not following, and hopefully that sort of graph network social pressure, customer pressure, dollar money pressure might make a difference. If there's no active supplier, you should maybe ask yourself, is it a good idea to keep using the software that is no longer actively maintained? It might be. I'm not saying what the answer is, but you should consider that very carefully. If it's sort of in the open source world, or even if it's not, you could take on responsibility for the stale software that you now care about, so a fork and take ownership. Or you could choose to accept the risk, that's fine also. But if you can't follow the supplier ID rules here because there aren't not an active supplier, also double check yourself on the use of that software. Thomas covered some of these, but I found some pictures, so I'm going to run through a couple of things. Yes, so there are a bunch of ID systems, but most of them include this supplier identifier as part of the system. So VIN has World Manufacturer Identifier, and this is not the full decoding of VIN. VIN is a super mess, so is ISBN, but somewhere in the first 1 to 3 alphanumeric ASCII English characters is manufacturer is hidden in there somewhere. I couldn't get a straight answer off the internet, but somewhere in there is manufacturer. ISBN's a little messy too. They have publisher or distributor is usually in there, so it's not quite supplier, but pretty close. Author is not in there, but whoever's fronting for the author is the supplier, and there's code in ISBN for this. Everyone know what 1.3.6.1.4.1 means? If you were around in the 80s, possibly the 70s in the internet. This is really, really old stuff. That is code for enterprise, I'll do it backwards, .private.internet.dod.org.iso. So you can't avoid the fact that US DoD was involved in the early days. And ISO, for some, also, I guess, which is nice. DoD is part of ISO.org, I think is what this is saying. Anyway, super old. Not sure it's that useful. The concept has come up, though. There are 60,000 plus entries in these the private enterprise numbers list. This stuff is so old they couldn't use ampersand for email. They use %. Like that is how old this list is. Also, apparently anyone can just get one. So not quite not a strong authoritative registrar in place. These things, and I forget the acronyms, came out of food and grocery buying. If you barcode something and you scan it, this is the evolution of that for all things with barcodes. Physical products, food, regulated medical devices in the EU and the US. There's a UDI prefix, or identifier, which is a required thing. You got to pay for these. There is an authoritative registrar. It's a .org, but they also sell stuff, so I'm not sure where that falls out. But they have a sliding scale, right? I've got a plastic widget. I want a barcode for it, 25 USD a year. I'm a giant corporation. I get a company prefix. That's the supplier ID. Global or GS1 company prefix is the section that carves off my namespace for my supplier. Yep, you can decode this also. Okay, so my personal thinking is I don't like centralization. There's resilience issues. There are risk issues. There's one single point of failure issues. I've talked myself into this registrar idea, but let's take a quick look at the concerns. First and foremost, pops into my head is sort of geopolitical. This is a little bit contrived since these are my colleagues, Thomas and Tom here, but maybe a company in Germany, maybe Siemens does not want to register with supplierid.us.gov. Completely understandable, right? We sort of deal with this in DNS land with there are these intermediate registrars and service providers. I have a .ls domain, and I'm not exactly sure who I bought it from, but it works, so I pay them for a subscription. There's cost, right? We saw the sliding scale for the global IDs. Shouldn't be any worse or more expensive or timely than getting a domain name. And this gets to sort of the inclusivity, right? Sliding scale, cheap enough, easy enough that a part-time, horrible open source software developer like myself could get an ID should I want one. Minimum viable bureaucracy. There's going to have to be bureaucracy, but let's not create a monster out of it. Absolute minimum bureaucracy to keep the thing moving. Transparency, publish all the IDs, publish the registry data. Resilience, I don't have a good answer for. You could make copies of the data, but does the organization survive? How are they funded? What's the governance model? I'll admit I don't have a great answer there. We all like DNS, so what I'm going to go do is go register for a new GTLD.SBOM. Hasn't been taken yet. You're not allowed to grab it. It's mine unofficially. Apparently, you have to do a lot of work to kick off a new GTLD, which I haven't done yet, like actually operate a registrar that exists. So we're going to work on that. While we're at it, maybe we have a very special protocol that is only for SBOM IDs. So SBOM, S is for secure, the second S is for secure, colon. I had a slide, I took it out, but I was going to have SBOM : / and then say you can redirect to the secure one, but you can't back down. Anyway, we'll leave that for later. We can make that simpler. It's really HTTPS with a proper API behind it. But there's some issue where I don't want. The registrar would not appreciate people just getting SBOM domains and putting crappy web content there. It has to be only for this supplier identification, component identification stuff. Here's the idea, right? The .SBOM root, you can have a bunch of suppliers. You can have a platform, GitHub. You can have an ecosystem, NPN. And in this case, that platform and ecosystem level is what we want to register and keep track of. What they do internally that happens to have a lot more software in it is up to them. We probably want a discussion with them as the registrar to say, hey GitHub, do you have a way to uniquely identify all of your projects and organizations? And they would say yes, and they would show us their URL syntax and it'd be fine. Again, the nice thing is platforms like that, package managers like that already work because they were designed to do exactly this, identify things in their own systems. The supplier graph connects to components. So this registrar does not care about the orange stuff. That's up to the suppliers and to decide what their hierarchies look like. The registrar cares about the root and the first level down. If you have a product family, a product name, different versions, a very complicated graph, that's great. That is the supplier's business and not the registrar's. We're not going to tell you how to do it, just that you have to and you have to tell others. A couple of contrived examples. I picked on Microsoft. I made this up entirely. I mean, this is a real product, but here's some ways you could represent these things. Here's a GitHub thing, and right away I ran into problems with, obviously, characters, and which is the meta character for separating the hierarchy. Is it a dot? Is it a slash? Is it a colon? We can fix that, but stupid computer, normal problems, right? Here's a made up. These are not made up, actually. These ones from GitHub are real. I can go find these, go dereference these things. There's a MISP tag. These two OpenBSD ones reference the same vulnerability, but two different ways to get to it. One's a commit, one's an actual .c file. So some examples there. Again, registrar cares about the root and the supplier. Everything else is whatever the supplier wants, the supplier says. CPE, we can slot CPE in as a supplier or actually an ecosystem. If you care to keep using CPE, which I think Thomas and Tom really want to do, we give CPE authority at the supplier level, and they can have the hierarchy that they choose. And that's perfectly fine. We can accommodate that. So, global registrar with minimum bureaucracy, but nonetheless some bureaucracy, and a tight grip on who gets to be a supplier is my proposal. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom for his piece of the puzzle.
Yes. You did not add my...
No, I think other way.
Other way, okay, yeah.
There you go.
The vendor product tree. So that's my approach. Let's start with what we do in general. What you see on the right side is one of our security advisories for Siemens products. We publish them on a regular basis, and of course, when you write a security advisory, you need to name the product that is affected. So the naming problem came very early to us. And today I want to talk about the thematic CP343-1, which is, of course, nobody calls it that. Yeah, everybody says it's a CP343. Yeah, and this is where things begin to become unclear, because you find the shorter name and the longer name both in manuals and in publications and so on. And so even with such a very clear identifier, the confusion already starts. And you find the same problem, not just in security advisories, you will find the same in SBOM. When people say, I use those 20 components, and they write it down like a letter to their mother, yeah, like in Microsoft Word, you cannot parse that one. You cannot rely on the identifiers being precise. Same will happen with VEX documents or in CISA that we all push heavily. But if you want to automate stuff, you need to have identifiers that are machine readable. So your whole supply chain management basically relies on that. So things that do not work. CPE, for example. People made up hundreds and thousands of CPEs for Siemens products, which just do not exist. We tried to clean it up, and we looked at the database, and we said we cannot clean that up. Yeah, so that's no chance, no chance. And also, what does not work is forcing vendors into one standard. When we say you need to do UUIDs for your products or whatever, not every vendor will follow. Think of Microsoft or Siemens. Yeah, they will not go that way. So we have 14 approaches of how to name things. My colleagues already introduced some of them. And we do not want to introduce the 15th version that basically competes with the other 14. So I just start how we started with our advisories back in 2015. I'm not sure if you can read that one. It's over here, CP 343-1. It does not say thematic, CP3. So we already have a naming problem on the chassis of the device. And what we did is we took that name and put it into our advisories, and we thought we have a very good correlation between our advisory and the product that is affected, and people must be satisfied, right? Until people said, well, I have the CP 343-1 lean. And the next one says, I have the CP 343-1 advanced. Are they also affected? And we were like, yeah, of course, that's the 343 family, yeah, so of course you're affected. But that's not so clear. So either you write it down, each and every member of the family, or you remain uncertain in some ways. So what we did is we said, okay, that one is the family, and this family has children. And these three are the children of this family. So we started to have a real graph or a real tree. And we were so proud because, yeah, problem finished. And then some guy came along and said, you have these more robust versions of those products. They are called C+. Are they also affected? And we are like, yes. Each of those has a robust and a less robust versions. And they have different order numbers, and they have different pricing, and they are, of course, also affected. So what you see here right now is basically the start of a product graph where you basically have the families that are more and more precise defined. And you can go on always deeper. You can go on language packs, and you can go into more details or less details, depending on how good you are in creating your graph. But in general, yeah, that's what a vendor needs to do. A vendor needs to point out, these are my official product names, and I have product families. You have a Volkswagen Golf, and which Golf? Yeah, you have lots of them. Yeah, I have a Epson projector over there. Yeah, which projector? There's a whole family in there. So as a vendor or as a software producer, you probably could organize your products into families. And some customers are satisfied with the rough name, family name, and others want to have the precise product they have. But the graph does not end here. So each of those hardware devices can run different versions of firmware, of course. And there's also a link. So not all of them run the same firmware. Yeah? So the graph becomes even larger. But when we look at it precisely, we realize that we have now introduced a different relation. So this relation with the blue arrows is called is family of. So this is the family of those, and this is the family of those. That's one relation in the graph. You can also add another relation, which is uses. So this hardware uses these firmware versions. And you can split that down. You can say this firmware version uses OpenSSL version 3.0.0, or this version uses Apache whatever. So from here to the right side, basically you get the SBOM. But on the left side with the blue arrows, you have the product families. That's not all relations there are. You can have another relation that's called identical. If you look at that one, you can say this product name is identical with that product name, and that could be a CPE, for example. So we don't invent the 15th version of naming things, but in such a graph, you can integrate all other 14th versions of naming things, like CPEs or Pearls or whatever, ISBN and all of the others. You can arrange them basically in a graph and say this identifier is identical to that identifier. So if you bought a book, or if you bought any product and you bought it under that identifier, you will now know that we have alternative names for those. Same if you look up here, you can give new names to your product. So renaming things. Your marketing says, that name is old. Maybe we got bad press. So let's invent a new name for the same product. Yeah, you can do that. Make a new name and mark it as identical to the old one. So even people who still know it under the old name will find it in your product graph that this is this new name. If you choose that the old name should not be used anymore, you can deprecate relations and basically say, don't use this. This is outdated. Do not delete them, because people might still rely on the old names. They have them in their databases, they have them noted down on some paper, they have it in Excel sheets, and they want to find their old names in your product graph again. So deprecate it and say, okay, it's deprecated since today, and the new name is up there. Yeah. And with this, you can rearrange things. You can, for example, deprecate a whole hierarchy in your product graph. When someone says, I don't like these family names anymore, yeah, throw them out, deprecate them, make new links, and then 5 years later, you get another product manager who says, I want to have new hierarchies. Yeah, then introduce your new hierarchies. That's really, really easy. Just link them in your product tree or product graph, and everyone can still follow when they have old identifiers in that. Finally, a relation is successor of. So for example, firmware versions. One can imagine that the firmware version 3.1.1 could be the successor of 3.0. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Note that down. Note that down in your product graph so people see which is the successor of what. Same up here. So when you have an old product and a new product, you can introduce the relation is successor of. So that's my idea. You have 5 different relations, and SBOM, everybody is talking about SBOM right now, yeah? But that's just one relation. This uses that and that and that, yeah? Okay, that's important to have an SBOM, but it's also important to have the other relations in your product graph. And this is for, yeah, basically identifying and including other systems of naming products. Bottom line, basically most of that has been said before. Every vendor creates his own product graph, and those names are authoritative. Don't invent Siemens names. This is our job. We have so much confusion out there. This just adds to the confusion. Every vendor needs to get his naming scheme straight. And when I want to make an SBOM, I rely on other vendors to have such a graph. And then I can just point to their authoritative identifiers. I can point to, this is what I use from vendor A, and this is what I use from vendor B. They need to get their ducks in a row, and we need to get our ducks in a row. And I don't interfere with their products, and they don't interfere with my products, please. Yeah. Every node and relationship has a creation date and a deprecation date. So you need to find the history of what happened. You take a snapshot of a vendor graph today, and then you make your asset management, and you say, I have these 20 products from the vendor. And then 5 years later, you revisit the site, and you find the names all changed. And you still need to be able to navigate. So don't delete anything, deprecate it, and tell it since when it's deprecated. Yeah, I think the rest I already covered. Yeah, that's basically the bottom line of what I just mentioned here. For consumers might find identifiers on product labels, order papers, website invoices, S&P scans. So they take a device, they see 5 different numbers, and when they normally type it in Google. So what is this product? Yeah, they put the number in Google. They should not. They should be able to find those identifiers in the vendor product graph. And yeah, that's basically it. Questions, welcome.
Sure. And as you prepare for questions, and I think we have a microphone somewhere that our session chair will be going around if you show hands. I'll start with kick off with a few questions here to the panel. So my first question was, how do we involve open source? You said we need that global register. How do you get the open source people on board?
Right. Well, I think it's straightforward. And there are some open source folks who know better and have greater experience than I do who argue with me about this. But the idea that getting the registration, right, whether it's cost or effort, subscriptions, maintenance, is no more difficult or costly than getting a DNS name, registering an account on GitHub. I think if we can follow that sort of path, we can alleviate all those concerns, right? Again, the part-time hobbyist can have a proper node. Maybe they don't have maybe they don't register an actual supplier level node, but I'm on GitHub. GitHub is the supplier of the ecosystem. My code is in NPM, or it's Java code in Maven somewhere, and Maven Central, and I can follow into that ecosystem and the hierarchy that way. That's the easy answer, I think, for the very sort of low budget, individual, part-time open source contributors. Of course, there's a huge variety of open source software sizes and shapes of organizations, and proprietary software as well. So, Red Hat, who used to always go around saying, we sell free software, which is a great joke. They're probably large enough to have a supplier ID, afford the proper supplier name, and run the hierarchy from their point of view. I think it's that simple, but this is a 60% baked idea, so welcome any discussion on how to be very inclusive of everyone. We have a question in the audience. Yeah. Maybe two.
Hi. So I have I have some experience in actually running a namespace. I used to do network management, and at some point we registered a global URN namespace, so I've gone through all of these problems, and I can recognize some of the things that you've been doing. So first off, you have two different solutions in your presentation. They're basically, one is the identification scheme, and the other one is metadata, I think. The question is, have you considered using a URN instead of a GTLD in DNS?
Yes, I mean it probably would have been a good example of other things that exist. There's a lot of work on namespaces, URN, a lot of ways to do this. So the upshot is there's experience here. I'm not sure exactly the right, which model to copy or what to use that already exists or not. It could be a URN, but day to day we're all looking at sort of URL things, which is related but not the same as an abstract namespace. I think you could implement it that way, right? If the URN is the SBOM root, and still whatever system gets used, the idea I have is that we really care about the root and then the very first level down. And after that, it's the Wild West, and Siemens can make up crazy marketing names for their stuff if they want, and that's their business. So I don't have a strong preference or experience as to which one to choose, as long as that first, the next hop down, next layer down is globally unique. That's the key to my solution, at least.
Yeah. And then you have to run a minimal registry that hands out the first level one.
I think so.
And then one question is, so there's two problems that I see. So one is collisions. How do you handle collisions? And the other one, at some point, a software vendor or a supplier is going to go bankrupt or leave, but we still have the software,
Right.
and we still have to be able to talk about it. So it has to stay there. So we have to have some system in place that we can actually still do that.
I would steal Tom's idea, right? From within the product graph of the vendor.
Yep.
But the same concept I think works, right? You have you deprecate a node, you can route around it, but it stays on the graph, right?
Yep.
I think that would work at the.
Yeah, it should work. So it doesn't disappear just because the vendor disappears. The identifier is still valid. Yeah.
It does have the downside, though, that once a node is taken, it never can be recycled.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Greg Toohill, Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute and CERT. With the advent of generative AI, dominating headlines, how does generative AI fit in a practical means within this model?
Do you want to take that?
I'm not sure.
Ask those people, yeah. I see. No, I have a partial answer, but I'm by no means.
So I'm not a fan of AI. So
Yeah.
your answer is better.
No, but I'm of a similar career stage, and also don't like these new things. But kids and their AI. I think, at least for the piece I'm looking at, I think the answer is AI can generate all the code it wants, but it better generate its identifiers also, and whoever's operating it needs, the supplier hierarchy rule still applies. So I'm going to make up a probably horrible analogy. If ChatGPT.4x whatever is generating code, maybe at the ChatGPT layer, that's the supplier, and whatever junk it generates, it just has to name itself and identify itself by following the rules. It could swamp the registrar possibly, or cause a lot of volume. But if you can point to the AI-generated code, that's fine. Is the code good or bad? I don't know. Do you want to use it? I don't know. But we just have to be able to reference it globally, uniquely. That's the key.
So the important thing is basically for everyone who it is in the interest of everyone who creates software to make an identifier for it. Because when I should use that software and I don't have an identifier to point to, then, for example, my SBOM I cannot create an SBOM if I don't have an identifier to point to. So I'm obliged to create an SBOM. So I will approach the guy who created the software. Please make me an identifier because I need it. Yeah. And if he doesn't do it, if he's either out of business or unwilling or whatever, then I have problems using his software, and I might look for some other software to use. And that might give the pressure. So I might say, this piece of code was ChatGPT generated, linked to ChatGPT, but then no further, so linked to the producer, to the provider, yeah? Linked to the provider, but he does not come up with identifiers. So everyone can see, this provider is a bad provider because he does provide software, yes, but he does not provide identifiers. He does not have his supply chain in order. So whenever you want your software to be used, you better provide those identifiers. It makes the life of everybody in the supply chain easier.
There's a
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. My name is Dag, by the way. Thank you for talking. But let's say a company today, they read an advisory, they see the product name, oh, we have that, and they check the version, and so on. But if a system like this is disseminated, is spread, then that would probably be automated, you know? So, you know, you read advisories, you get a flag if you have software. But in that case, what kind of regime would you propose to so that customers can trust that the product names and the information in the registry is correct, and who can perform those changes? Because in an extreme case, an attacker might want to attack a few businesses, and they would attempt to subvert the information in the registry so that their automated systems won't flag that they have a vulnerability and they won't patch the vulnerability. I don't know if you understood what I'm getting at.
No, I think I do. So first point is, you're absolutely right. Things will be automated. This is not possible today because of the identifiers that are not working, and CISA, the advisory format, is not broadly used. Yeah. Yes.
And my point was that because it can't really be automated, then you get humans looking at it. And then you get a human mind making assumptions. Mm-hmm. But in the future, you might not have that. You might just have an automation.
The problem is, currently we have 20,000 CVEs last year, 20,000 vulnerabilities. And when you map them on the 20,000 Siemens products, you probably would get out millions of advisories or millions of combinations. This is affected, this is not affected. We should provide VEX, we should provide all the data, and you will have no possibility for any human to cope with that amount of data. Even the 20,000 vulnerabilities that we have right now per year, how many are those per day? I think it's 50 per day. Yeah. So, and it's growing. Next year it will be more, and next year it will be more. So we need to find a solution where things can be automated. So some things can be automated, and some things still need to have a human eye, protein computer processing that. Yeah, and we work on that. This is why we do this. This is why we do CISA. This is why we do unique product identifiers, because we need to automate stuff. We possibly cannot automate everything. I agree completely with you. And the automation will bring new challenges into the game. Also agreed. But we cannot just stay in the old PDF printout. So our largest advisory is 50 pages. A tree has to die if you print that out and walk through your. So that's not feasible for the future anymore.
But can you answer, how do you propose to authorize who is legally allowed to make changes to their part of the tree?
That's the registrar.
So you would be basically placing some trust that the registrar decided that the people from Siemens who called up and said register Siemens were indeed Siemens. So, but very much we could borrow from PKI and SSL certificates and TLS, right? You would be trusting a registrar, which is an issue. It's a trust issue always. But then I don't have a strong opinion on the technical exchange, but right, HTTPS and certificates, and we can sign data. The normal things that we use today, I would expect similar technical techniques to say, my machine's grabbing millions of Siemens VEX records, and the certificate's still valid, and it's all good. And so I'm going to keep processing, and I'm going to believe the chain of trust. I have nothing further than, copy those ideas. It's working for us mostly today.
Mm-hmm. And then,
thank you.
At the end, if you all look into it, you probably can't solve the supply chain trust issue. So if you really want to know it, you have to make a business trip to your supplier, and hopefully they have their supplier ID somewhere engraved in the headquarters in stone or something, so that you can actually go there and check.
So to answer the previous question with regards to the trust within this system, there's no real technical way to solve this. I mean, you can use TLS certificates, but they're only valid for a certain amount of time. And the idea of an identifier is that it's unique also in time. So that's one thing I should mention. Also, some of the experience that I had is that you included, you should probably include some kind of temporal element, so maybe a year that you assign the identifier, so that you have, that you guarantee that you have control of the DNS name in that year, because it can expire, and nobody knows what the world is going to look like in 50 years, and Siemens might be called differently, and somebody else might take up the name Siemens, and then you have to have the namespace still that they can name the things. So
the question then becomes, is it feasible to have like the fancy vanity names, or do we just go with more or less non-human related, non-human readable related names?
I think you can have both.
Yeah, you could have both.
But if you use some kind of advisory, then you have to feel that it has the full identifier in there, and then you can also have a human readable name in the same document.
No, I wasn't talking about the documents that we produce. I was just talking about the identifier itself. So if you use a non-human readable way, like a hash value or something like that, nobody can actually complain that they didn't got their company's name. So since nobody gets it, and it also helps you in that way that you can assign those names for basically eternity. So once the name is taken, you have to get another one.
Now, the registrar has to stay solvent, and the director of the registrar has to lead a reasonably comfortable lifestyle. So we're going to sell the brand vanity name to those who can afford it. So the alias for if Siemens wants Siemens on there, we'll have a discussion about how much that's going to cost. And if you don't want to pay, you can have just the GUID and use that and see if anyone knows who you are.
Let's go that way. Yeah.
Good. But we can discuss.
But in general, the problem is not just with the unique product identifiers, it's also with PDF advisories or firmware downloads or whatever. So when you cannot trust that the Siemens firmware is from Siemens, you have a problem.
Absolutely.
An identifier is not going to solve that problem.
No, it solves another problem.
Yes.
It solves the problem that people have their asset database here and our advisories there, and then the products have different names in both databases, so they don't know, should I patch now or should I not patch? And the same with SBOM, and the same with VEX, and the same with every security communication. When you say, I have a problem in X, and he says, well, I'm not sure if I do have X here, yeah, because it's slightly different. So getting this fixed is one huge step further, and it won't solve everything, of course, but that's one thing that we need to solve in the next years. Please.
So actually, this kind of leads on from that, because one of the concerns that I have here is level of granularity and the trend that we have in software factories and programming houses to reuse all the way down to the single line. And then modify those in ways that maybe are not significant with regard to vulnerabilities and other ways that we would label it. So having a big base of code that says Siemens, that's great. But having open source code where I've taken half from Stack Overflow and I've changed it and half from other kinds of areas and I've changed that, how am I going to rectify labels in the current trend of very small granularity modifications to existing code?
In theory, the supplier or the code house or the hoster can, it's really up to them. If they want to go to line of code, I mean, I think today in GitHub I can get a hard link to the line in the file, right? I mean, here's a commit short hash on an actual file, and they happen to version them that way. So, at the registrar level, go nuts. And the hierarchy will work, or it won't, or it'll explode, or we won't have enough memory to hold it all. I'm not sure where that's going to go. But in theory, you can have the hierarchy that you want. I don't know what will become practical. Yeah, we discussed, I think, Stack Overflow is a supplier level, and this URL on this date, I grabbed the code, and it was vulnerable, and it went everywhere. I mean, that's a good question. But again, on paper, go as granular as you choose at the cost of complexity and all that.
I think the difficulty was one you just mentioned. I've got two things. They have two different
Mike,
labels.
yeah.
They came from,
Sorry, people are, yeah.
They came from the same place. I don't know what to patch. I don't know whether I should patch or not. All I have is two labels that one is interior to another, and it's been, so again, the whole purpose of this is to give me action.
Yeah.
To allow me to take action. And I worry that just the labeling itself may not be enough to tell me what action I can take.
Yeah. Tom just mentioned this, but to me, and my initial interest in all of SBOM in the first place in this identifier is, right, we're at an advisory and you write some stuff down. It has nothing to do with any of the actual lists of assets or the internal vendor list or anything. Could we get closer to having one set of identifiers for things? A lot of stuff needs to talk about it, right? Inventory, which license applies where, where's a vulnerability, how many suppliers do I have too many bits of code? But what are the names of all the Siemens things that they keep rebranding? There's a lot you can do with it, but when we have these disparate sources of the identifiers, it's just a mess. We've got to do better there, I think, so. Yeah. Sorry, there's a, Chris, yeah.
Yeah, so earlier on you mentioned two examples, VIN numbers and ISBNs of global identifiers. My immediate thought on that was that these have succeeded in the industry either through government regulation and requirements or extensive partnerships with companies that manufacture products, or because without, say for example, an ISBN, you're not going to find the book that you want, so ISBN gets included by default. How can you go from asking vendors to do this to actually having this being ubiquitous across the industry? It seems like that is the gap. Someone like Siemens is going to say, this is going to work for us and we're going to use it. Someone in foreign countries may look at this and say, not interesting, don't care. They may look at it and say, I don't need to provide an SBOM because I'm not selling to the US government, therefore SBOM is not interesting to me. How do you reach those markets that are not very focused on this?
So I don't want to pick on Europe. There is something upcoming regulation called Cyber Resilience Act, and I know many people fear it and don't like it. But basically, the idea behind this is, if you want to bring an element into market, and there it comes, market regulation. You actually have to do certain things. And maybe at some point, one of these things will be you have to provide unique identifiers. And the system around is, as my two colleagues have presented, you're able to point to an empty node, to an empty supplier tree. So now the question arises, how do I point to an empty supplier tree if the supplier doesn't participate in a thing? Well, still some questions open there. If I have a register where I need actively to register stuff, that's potentially a problem. If I rely on existing sources like DNS that is already there, that might be easier to point to a specific, say, .valknown/upid/empty, and then there is the empty node that exists by default, and even if it responds with any server error or any other thing than a redirect to the actual graph or a deprecation node and a link to the graph where it's now, it is the empty node. And then you can say, hey, that supplier doesn't have anything. If I now find the supplier has deprecated its empty node and now has something, okay, perfect. Now I should probably call the guy where I found that link and say, hey, you might want to update the node that you have, since there is now a graph. Please be more specific what you're actually using or providing at that point.
So if I'm reading this right, and tell me if it's wrong, if you're not part of the tree and you don't have an identifier, then you're the bad guy. You're not on, if you're not on the list, you're not coming in.
Yep.
You are not following the rules. Everyone else can see that you're not following the rules, and we'll see what happens next. I don't have a grand plan, but you already covered this, right? I mean, you know, ISBN, I think the history was more market-driven. Some of these are regulated in sector-specific things. I'm not sure if VIN, I'm not sure who decided to have VINs and how that worked either. I mean, when I register things in the United States, I need my VIN. When I buy things, it's tracked by the VIN. I don't know if the government anywhere ever sat down and said, you must have a VIN and it must be this. So there's, you know, it turns out even competitors in industry might want some common infrastructure, and that's driven a lot of these. And then in some cases, right, at least sector-specific, or the US government, or at the EU level, to sell software to us or in our market, thou shalt register, have an ID. At some point, that becomes just get one, because it's just too hard not to mess around.
And to make this clear, when someone does not play by the rules and has no graph and does not participate, and I use his software, this might become a problem for myself, because people, when they look at the SBOM, they say you are using unmaintained software or unclear software in an unclear state. I do not want to buy your system for my critical infrastructure if you rely on someone who does not play by the rules, not unclear status. Does he publish patches? What does he do? Yeah, it's unclear for me. So when I use his software, this will bring problems for me, and this creates pressure on myself. So maybe I look for some other provider, and this provides pressure on him for, dear sir, we were working together since 10 years, but now I need to look for someone else, yeah? So the pressure could lead to improvement there.
And following up on that, when do you expect product graphs to be operational?
So we are currently working on it since years, and you will find it in our advisories probably next year. So you currently you have up to 20 pages of affected products, because we just list the leaves of the tree, yeah. But we are working on to make it collapsible, where you say I have this family, and the customer can say, that's interesting. I think I own one of those. And he can expand this in the HTML advisory. And then he can navigate through the tree and find just to make the HTML document more human readable. For the CISA, it doesn't matter how long it is. Yes, so I don't care. But for human readers, this interactive advisory is in the making, and we will probably have it next year, visible.
And when is the register operative?
Well, I wanted to get through this talk this week and see if there was any significant barriers that came up during the discussion. But you know, I'm going to start next week. I don't know. This really is an idea, and I said this in the beginning. Throughout the SBOM work, I was involved in the NTIA and US era sort of SBOM work in some of the papers, and you know, distributed, no single point of failure, resilient, were sort of the things running through my head the entire time. And of course, people thought maybe there should be a single global SBOM database or repository, and I don't think that will ever work. It may not be enough computer memory or electricity, and also it's a single point of failure. So I really am conflicted about the need for the registrar, but on the other hand, you know, if we all just declared a GUID or a random namespace or hashed our domain name or stuck to DNS, I don't think those are going to work. I think it'll be messy and it won't move quickly enough. So I think in this case, again, against my normal interests or ideas, we need a limited registrar. So I've got to start a nonprofit, I guess. I have to hire myself as director. Like I said, I'm going to need some branding funds from some of the bigger players to get these things up and running. So maybe some friendly government support for the first 2 to 5 years. You know, these things are possible. I'm you know, half joking, but we'll see. Maybe not. Yeah. If anyone's interested in truly following up, by all means, I'm serious enough to have a discussion. But at this point, it's really slideware and a couple of things written down in some documents.
So when we talk about Siemens product graphs, are there, when you say you publish them in, say, one year, are they then correct, complete? Do you can I fully understand what Siemens has to offer, or?
So that's one learning that in the beginning we thought, so in the 1980s, 90s, we thought we could make error-free software.
Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah, we thought that, yes. And now we realize this is human-made, and when we sell it and we ship it, we still need to maintain it because there are errors. Yeah? And we make our advisories to fix that. Yeah? And now we find that our advisories are not error-free, and we need to update them frequently. So I expect everything that we generate and put out is wrong and will never be right. Be it software, be it SBOM, be it VEX, be it anything. It's always faulty when you supply it, and you need to constantly maintain it, of course. And the graph could be maintained, so you can always deprecate false entries, and you can introduce new ones, and you can really work on that. So that's already a part of it.
Okay. We have 5 minutes left. There is one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Just wanted.
Yep.
Hi, my name is George. I'm wondering how free software developers fit into this, really. You mentioned putting them behind the GitHub namespace, for example, but maybe I don't want that. Maybe I don't have the means or interest in really paying for an ID. So how would that work?
Yeah, you know, I use the GitHub example as to cover some portion, maybe a significant portion of open source, but certainly not all. Again, you know, I guess you're welcome to not participate. You know, there's always the choice. I could publish software and not have a supplier reference or hierarchy, and my software is still there. It is possible, in theory, right, it's possible that this individual or a small company or small organization can just self-register. And it's again, the design is it should be very inexpensive, nominal fee, a little bit of paperwork, fill out a web form and email, maybe do a DNS trick to prove that you are who you are, something fairly straightforward. So, make it possible. We wouldn't be able to force anyone, really leaving it to, right, people noticing holes in the graph, some social, some network pressure, some customer pressure, depending on the nature of your software. Right, we could always have things like the left pad and the malicious NPM modules and things where someone takes their software and goes home or something like that. We're not going to solve that. You could have similar problems in this sort of a tree, but we have to accept those and live with them. There's not a, it's not going to be we're not going to walk around being the .SBOM police and say, hey, you're making software and why aren't you registered yet? I mean, if Siemens doesn't, we'll probably have to chase them down, but there'll be edges and non-participants, and that's okay. And if the market forces are, we're going to keep using this unreferenced software, fine. Maybe the registrar will step in and, out of the goodness of our hearts, just register for them.
Sorry to interrupt you, but my point being that it should actually be possible to just get an ID if you're a software developer and do the publishing yourself. So it's not the point of I don't want to participate because I find it really a good idea, but really that should not be a hurdle of paying money for getting an ID or being forced to be put on the hierarchy that you.
I agreed, and maybe it's free for individual use, right? Or and you make up an alias. I don't really care who you are. Just you want to tell me where you live, what country you're in. Just give me some reference point, and maybe it's free for individual use up to something, right? There are models for this. It can be inexpensive or free. We'll find something, I think.
So one model would be, for example, to have the data in, if you have a website, Siemens.com, we have the security.text, and there it says, okay, our product graph is here. So when you have a website, you have a DNS, you paid for it, a few bucks, yes, but then you already have the registrar via DNS and the security text. Yeah, that could be one approach. He does not like it, and there are reasons for not liking that. But that would be a approach where basically nearly every open source contributor, they have a website somewhere, and they could use that one.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time here.
Last question, are you going to set up a SIG?
Open for discussion? No, maybe.
You're going to need to produce documents.
Yeah, or run a registrar, which, so maybe, thank you. Yeah, truly open for discussion, but this is a presentation, so yeah. Yeah,
so thank you for all being here, and if you have any further questions or want to discuss that, we'll be here after in the break, and happy to take those or discuss it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.